All right. Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for being here for Variables in Sourdough Fermentation, taught by David Norman of Easy Tiger. My name is Nora Shabanik, and I am the Deputy Director at Texas Farmers Market. And I just want to thank everyone so much for being here and for supporting our local farmers and ranchers today at what is our 8th annual celebration of the Austin Fermentation Festival. This event is hosted by Texas Farmers Market, and we are a nonprofit centered around hosting and educating Central Texas producers and consumers to grow a sustainable food center. We love having you all here on Zoom tonight, and we hope that you'll come out and see us at the farmers markets. We run TFM at Lakeline on Saturdays from 9 a.m. to 1 p.m. and TFM at Mueller on Sundays from 10 a.m. to 2 p.m. Easy Tiger is a fabulous vendor there, and if you want to visit their booth at the farmers market, I highly encourage you to get delicious breads and baked goods. Just a little housekeeping for the event tonight. During the talk, we ask that everyone keep their audio and video muted so that if you have any questions, just drop them into the chat and I can kind of field them for David this evening. Or if you would like to ask him yourself at the end of the presentation, have a little more of a conversation going, just drop your name into the chat box and we'll put you in a queue for audience questions at the end. We'll unmute you when it's your time to speak. Please don't forget that in addition to the workshops, we are also hosting an amazing silent auction again this year. Items have been donated from wonderful local businesses and fermentation festival favorites, including a wonderful gift card to Easy Tiger and David Norman's book that is signed, as well as items from great local businesses like William Chris Vineyards, Emmer and Rye, Bunkhouse Hotels. Bidding is fully virtual through the website 32 Auctions, but you have to sign up for an account, and the auction is going to run through November 1st at 9 p.m. Auction items can be picked up at Texas Farmers Market or shipped to out-of-town winners. And we encourage everyone to bid early and to bid often because please remember that while this talk is free, any donations and bids in our silent auction will benefit the Texas Farmers Market and our Agricultural Support Fund, which allows us to support farmers and ranchers and all producer vendors during times of crisis like Winter Storm Uri, when we gave out over $20,000 of immediate assistance, and provides funding for our scholarship for our new BIPOC farmers joining Texas Farmers Market. So please bid generously. And I will drop some links for the silent auction and to donate into the chat box. So now on to the main event, why we're all here, onto our workshop. We are so excited to have David returning to the Austin Fermentation Festival as a presenter again this year. David Norman has spent over 30 flour-dusted years at some of the country's best bakeries from Seattle to New York City, launching the renowned Easy Tiger Bake Shop program in 2012. David was recently nominated for a James Beard Foundation Award in the Outstanding Baker category, and we are so thrilled to have him here tonight. So I will let you take it away, David.
Thank you, Nora. Yeah, it's exciting to be back here at the Fermentation Festival. I'm going to be talking about sourdough baking and specifically the variables in the process, and hopefully giving you a guide to kind of understanding those variables and how to use them together to kind of steer your bread in the direction that you want it to go in. We found, of course, during the pandemic, especially in the beginning of the pandemic, this tremendous surge in interest in sourdough baking. Everybody knows that. There was memes and jokes and everything about sourdough, but it's a great thing because sourdough has been trending for quite a while. That just kind of pushed it into a lot more people's laps. And but one of the things that comes out of it, or that's interesting about it, is there are so many different ways to make sourdough. There are so many different types of sourdough bread, and there are different methods to get to a sourdough bread. And there is no one definitive method. There's no way to say, this is the right way to make a sourdough. There are many, 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 many ways of making sourdoughs from many different baking traditions. And then there are people pushing the limits and experimenting and doing different things all the time with sourdough. For a home baker, and especially somebody that's just gotten into this as a hobby and is starting out, sometimes that can be a little confusing, especially if you read one place that you can do it this way and then another place that you do it that way. And then you start to play around, and maybe you take something from one method and recipe and try to use it in another one, and it doesn't really work in the way that you wanted it to. So what I want to do here is not tell you the one right way to make sourdough, but tell you sort of some of those variables that go into the fermentation, because sourdough, all bread baking is about fermentation, but sourdough is a special kind of fermentation because it's a double fermentation. It's an alcoholic fermentation. That's the yeast. In this case, it's wild yeast that is converting sugars into alcohol and carbon dioxide. It's the same thing as beer and wine production, where you're transforming sugars into alcohol and carbon dioxide. In beer and wine, you're capturing the alcohol and the carbon dioxide dissipates. Sure, in the end of beer making, you can build up some carbonation in the beer, or you can add it from a tank if you want to. Wines, still wines, you let it all go. With sparkling wines, there are different methods of adding, again, natural and then forced ways of making it carbonated. But in general, you're capturing the alcohol and letting the carbon dioxide go. In baking, it's the opposite. We're capturing the carbon dioxide and we're letting the alcohol go. So my standard joke there is you can eat 5 baguettes and get really full, but you won't get drunk off them because the alcohol is all gone. But the carbon dioxide is captured by the gluten that's developed in our dough. I'm not going to go too heavy into that part of bread making, but if you have any questions about it, I'd be happy to answer them. But in general, back to the sourdough fermentation. So it's the alcohol fermentation that's converting sugars by the yeast, the wild yeast, into carbon dioxide and alcohol. But then there's a secondary fermentation going on in sourdough. And because there's some lactobacillus bacteria in there working in harmony with the yeast and converting other sugars also into acids and carbon dioxide and other compounds. And they're doing this sort of in symbiosis and harmony with each other. And that's where we get these completely different and interesting flavors in sourdough bread that we can get from a yeast bread. We can certainly get really nice yeast bread. You don't think of, I don't like to think of it as yeast bread as just the Wonder Breads of the world. We can make wonderful baguettes and French breads and other yeasted breads by using yeast in the right way. But sourdough is a different process, and it's because it has this double fermentation. So lactobacillus is the same kind of fermentation that you're doing with pickles and sauerkraut and different vegetables and things, where it's lactobacillus fermenting the sugars and changing things. And all of this, of course, the carbon dioxide we're using in bread baking as our leavening to lighten the dough, but it's all building flavor, very different kinds of flavor, interesting flavors. And what we're going to talk about today is how to influence the direction of those flavors and how to play with those different variables to make a bread that kind of what you want your bread to be. It's great to follow recipes and try different recipes, try different people's methods. That's all really fun. I like to do that too. But hopefully you'll come out with an understanding of how you might be able to make your own sourdough bread kind of the way you see it, the way you envision it, the way you taste it in your mind. So, Nora, if we could go to the first slide, or the next slide, please. Great. So the 3 main variables in sourdough fermentation are temperature and ratios and time. Next slide, please. All right, so we're going to start out talking about mainly about the starter itself. Hopefully, most of you know what a sourdough starter is. It's a culture of wild yeast and lactobacillus, like I said, that is sort of captured in a flour and water mixture and then propagated. It's fed. You continue to maintain this culture, and you can use it week after week after week or month after month. You can keep this starter alive. This culture, you can keep it healthy and alive and working for you for a long time. So you always want to, of course, make enough starter that you have a little bit left over that you can feed to keep it perpetuating it. So temperature is our first variable. And the temperature that you keep your starter at can influence the flavor of your bread. Warmer temperatures tend to favor lactic acid production. Lactic acid is a milder acid. I put a milk carton in there next to that because lactose is a milk sugar. Lactic acid comes from a conversion similar to that. And it's a mild sour flavor. It's a sweeter sour, if that makes any sense, or a sweeter acid flavor. Cooler temperatures tend to develop more acetic acid, which is a sharper, tangier acid. It's more on the vinegar side. So think of those, you know, that difference, a lactic acid versus an acetic acid. Temperatures above 30 degrees Celsius tend to favor the lactic acid, and temperatures of 20 degrees and below tend to favor the acetic acid. So if you're looking for a strong, tangy sourdough, you want to keep your starter at a lower temperature. And that means feeding it with colder water, maybe adding some ice, especially in Texas in the summertime. I've done feedings where I need to get the water temperature down around 3-4 degrees Celsius to get my starter temperature down enough. And then I don't really want it down to fully refrigerator temperature. I don't want it in that 36 to 40 degree range. I'd rather keep it up, 45 to 50 degrees. Now I'm talking Fahrenheit. Sorry, I'm switching back and forth. So I tend to, if I'm really trying to control that temperature, I put it in a bag, like a lunch bag with an ice pack, and that kind of holds that temperature nicely. When I want a warmer temperature, I feed it with warmer water. I've used 45 to 50 degrees Celsius, which is quite warm, and it sounds dangerous, but it's not, because the flour tempers that temperature right away, and the starter itself will as well. But to get it up and maintain it around 30 degrees, 28 to 30 or a little bit above, that's great. The only time I've ever really killed a sourdough, besides just leaving one for weeks and weeks and weeks sitting on my counter, is when I did a too high of a temperature. And that actually did kill it. I tried to make this crazy little proof box with a light bulb, and it got too hot, and it stayed too hot and killed the sourdough. Couldn't bring that one back. But a 45 to 50 degree temperature, that's not going to kill your starter at all. It's just going to get that fermentation temperature up in that range where you really are producing lactic acid. Okay, now let's go to the next slide, please. The next variable are the ratios, and that's like how much starter do you feed? For Easy Tiger's sourdough and the sourdoughs that I have in my book, I'm feeding kind of a modest, or a healthy, hearty meal, but just a meal. to my sourdough. Other ways of doing it, other methods, you can actually feed a lot to your sour. It's like a meal versus a feast. And what the feast does is it just takes it longer to ferment through it. So it slows down the fermentation rate. So in general, if I have 100 grams of starter, I'm going to feed it with 100 grams of flour, equal weight. 100 grams of starter, 100 grams of flour. And then our particular hydration, it's a stiffer sourdough. We add 60 grams of water to that. Mix that up and let it ferment. If I want to slow that fermentation down, and I'll talk about why I want to do that later, but if I want to slow that down, I can either feed it twice as much. I could feed it 200 grams, or I could just use less starter. So I would use 50 grams. So either way, I'm using double the weight of the starter in flour, but I'm keeping the ratio of water and flour the same. So I'm still feeding it with 60 grams of water. Or if I doubled the flour, say I started with 100 grams of starter, 200 grams of flour, then I'd use 120 grams of water. That same ratio, 60 parts. And we'll talk more about ratios later. But again, what you're doing is you either have a lot of culture and feeding them a sort of a modest meal or a hearty meal, or you have a smaller starter, a smaller culture, and you're feeding it this big meal, this big feast. It's going to take them longer to eat. They're going to linger at the table for an extra couple of hours. They're going to be more French, although ironically, the French style sourdough would do the opposite. All right, next slide, please.
All right, and David, we had a question before we go on to the next slide.
All right.
Someone asked, how do you know when the starter is dead or unusable?
If you feed it and it just doesn't move at all, you have no rise whatsoever, then it's dead. If you feed it and you get some rise, but it's slow, sluggish, it's not very responsive, then it's not dead, it just needs some work. And there are a couple things you can do. You can keep feeding it, like on kind of regular intervals, and see if you can get it back to health. There's also, at sometimes what happens is you just build up too much acid. It's not the pH of it, but it's like there's just too much acid present in it. And you can do this method called washing the sourdough. So you make it stiff, very stiff, even stiffer than the 60%. And then you soak it, you cut it into little slices and soak it in water for an hour or so. And then you take it out and you've actually taken some of the acid out of it. And then you feed it again and that will revive it. You can also try feeding it a little bit more flour. I don't want to get too deep into that because it's going to confuse you with what I just said and what I'm going to say in a little bit. But there are ways of reviving a sourdough. So if you have activity, but it's just sluggish, then it's not dead. You just need to feed it a couple times. And especially like most of us that are home bakers are going to be keeping our sourdough in the refrigerator and taking it out to use for baking. And so if you give it a couple feeds before you bake with it, you're better off than just doing one feed. That first feed is going to wake it up and get it kind of, stretching its muscles a little bit. And then that second feed is what really gives it its energy and it's ready to go. And sometimes maybe if you've left it longer, maybe it needs 3 feeds. That's what I'm saying. If you have activity, if it's growing, you can see some movement in it, it's not dead. You just need to baby it a little bit and bring it back. Okay? Great. So our other variable is time. And time also goes hand in hand with the feeding and the temperature. And we'll talk about that a little bit more in a minute. But if you have this warmer starter that you fed sort of this hearty meal, but not a big feast, like I do for a lot of my sourdoughs, your time, it's going to take about around 8 hours for that culture to really mature again on that meal. So if I have that 100 grams of starter and feed it 100 grams of flour and 60 grams of water, at 12 o'clock, I'm going to be feeding it again about 8 o'clock, and then feeding it a third time about 4 o'clock. Next slide, please. Whereas if I fed that, and I've added one in here, if I fed that smaller amount, that 50 grams, the 100 grams and 60 grams of water, I'm going to need to leave that a little longer for it to finish that meal. So time is definitely a variable. It's also, it goes hand in hand with the ratios, with the temperature. Warmer temperature, it's going to move faster. Lower temperature is going to move slower. All right, next slide, please. So like I said, nothing is in isolation. So here you can see a little diagram again of your lactic acid versus your acetic acid. And it doesn't have to be one or the other. You can be in the mid-range with some of these things, get some of each. It just depends what your goal is, your end goal. A warmer temperature, you're going to need to feed more often, and you're probably going to want to feed that kind of hearty meal, not a big feast. But an interesting thing to try is, well, maybe I'll use that warmer temperature, but what if I feed it less often? And what can I build up? As long as you're keeping the yeast culture healthy and so you have good activity, that's an interesting experiment to try too. Now, if you want that super tangy sourdough, then you do all the opposite. You use a lower temperature. You might only feed it a couple of times before you make your dough, and you want to take more time in between those feedings. But kind of your fermentation rate is going to be lower anyway because of the lower temperature and because of the greater feed. So it's going to naturally take longer time. And you'll want to look at your sourdough. Can you see me like these sourdoughs on my screen as well? I can't see myself right this second. Sorry.
Yeah, that looks good, David. We can see them.
Okay, so this one on the right you can see is kind of collapsed on top. That's definitely mature and definitely ready for another feed. You could let it go a little bit longer, but this is probably right when you want to feed it. Whereas this one is domed on top, there's a little bit less volume. I'm generally, for my method, and again, there's so many different methods, but for my method, I'm looking for about 3 times the volume that I started with. That's why a clear-sided container like this, my favorite one is actually even glass. It's a wet jar that's glass. So you can see, like you just mark with a marker on the side there, and then you see how many times it's grown. So, but this is you're sort of looking, actually, this is collapsed a little bit. You're looking for it right between these two. In fact, this one actually is looking great because if I touch it, it's going to start to collapse. So you're looking for that maturity. You're looking for how much it grows, and then how it kind of domes or starts to fall. One variable that I've left out of this equation is the hydration of the starter, whether you're using a stiff starter or a more liquid starter. So ours is a stiff starter. It's more dough-like. And as I said, it's 60 parts water to 100 parts flour. Another common starter is equal weight of flour and water. So that would be 100% hydration. 100 parts of flour, 100 parts of water. That's a very common starter. And sort of conventional wisdom is that the stiffer starter helps to make more sourdough, and wetter starter can favor more the lactic side. I haven't found that in experiments to be that crucial or that big of a variable. So at least between 60 and 100%. Maybe if I stretched it a little bit further in either direction, it might make more of a difference. But so I don't really see that the type of starter, the hydration of your starter itself, makes a whole lot of difference when I've isolated that as my only variable in making a dough. So, all right, but again, nothing works in isolation in these variables, so that if you are using warmer temperatures, you're going to have a faster rate of fermentation. So you're probably going to want to be feeding more often and using it a little bit sooner. But okay, we'll go on to the next slide. Sorry, I'm getting ahead of myself. All right, now we're going to have a lesson in math. It's not hard math, though, and we're not going to get too far in depth with it. But so bakers we don't actually talk about recipes so much. We talk about formulas. So bread equals flour plus water plus salt plus yeast, some kind of yeast. It can be the wild yeast in the sourdough, or it can be, baker's yeast, commercial yeast. Both are basically, I often say that I've gotten away from calling sourdough natural fermentation. It's very much natural, and it's wild yeast. It's cultivated by you. It was started by you, or you got it from somebody that started it from wild yeast and wild bacteria. And it's certainly very natural. But the problem is it sets off this dichotomy that somehow then says that commercial yeast is not natural, and that's not true. Commercial yeast is a natural product. It's the same thing. It's this fungus that grows, and there are many, many different types of yeast, and even within one type, there are different varieties of that type of yeast. Something I think is interesting in beer making, sort of the different types of yeasts are celebrated because they do make a difference in the flavor and style of the beer when they're used, in addition to the method that's used. And we tend to, in baking, unfortunately, you can't use, like, the subspecies don't differentiate quite as much as in beer. I think that's probably because the real volatile flavors that are created by the different strains of yeast are probably dissipated in the baking process. But certainly what I'm getting back to is that Saccharomyces cerevisiae is a natural thing. It's the same, it's one of those varieties of yeast, of fungus. And in fact, some sourdough starters have Saccharomyces cerevisiae in them. That's one of the wild yeasts in their mix. And it's not because they were created in a bakery where there was commercial yeast around. It's because Saccharomyces cerevisiae is a wild yeast. It's just one that happens to ferment grains super well. So it's been isolated and grown in a laboratory-like conditions, and then propagated and processed into either dried yeast or compressed yeast to use in baking. And I know we're talking about sourdough right now, but I'm just going to finish up by saying if you use commercial yeast properly in small amounts and give good long fermentation times, you can get excellent bread. It's not the same as sourdough, because sourdough, like I said, is that double fermentation. You have the yeast doing the alcoholic fermentation, but you also have the lactobacillus doing that lactic acid fermentation as well. Next slide, please.
All right. Also, David, we had a quick question about the starter hydration. Somebody asked, what is the advantage of 60% hydration versus 100% for you?
For me, in our setup at Easy Tiger, it's easier for us to mix a dough and to store it and to bring it out and put it into the mixer. There are bakeries that have like these big tubs that they can maintain a liquid starter by agitating it and controlling the temperature. I've worked in bakeries where we've used those. Those are great. It's part because our sourdoughs are kind of come out of the French tradition, and the way I learned, one of the ways I learned, I've learned a lot of ways, but kind of the method that I gravitated towards was the French pain au levain, and most traditionally that uses a solid starter. And actually in France, it's a 50% hydration, but our flour just needs more water. And I did notice that we were doing a 50% hydration when I worked in New York, and then I visited a bakery in France, and I got to see their starter and the base recipes. And just the feel of their starter was looser than ours. So I went back and I added just 10% more water and got that same feel because our flour just absorbs more water. And then our starter was just more lively, it just perked up, and we got better volume in our loaves and everything. So that's just a side thing. But I just find that the dough consistency, besides following that tradition, I find that dough consistency works super well in our production system. At home, when you're mixing it, in a bowl by hand, maybe the liquid is more handy, seems more handy. I know when especially if you do it by hand, if you're doing the stiff starter, because there's no salt in there, it gets kind of sticky and it sticks to your hands and it's harder to get down the drain and all those things. So that's one reason why I say that I really haven't found that much difference in the flavor of the bread from just the hydration of the starter. So if you're used to working with 100% hydration, and you can go back on our breadwinners on Facebook and see some information about how to convert recipes from one to the other or back, either from solid to liquid. It's not hard to do at all. You're just shifting where the water is. You have the same total amount of water and the same total amount of flour in your dough. You're just shifting where it comes from. So if you have more water in your starter, you just have to put a little less in the final dough, or vice versa. But if you have a stiff starter with less water, you have to add a little bit more in your final dough. Cool. All right, so our math lesson. Normally, when we think of percentages, like when I bought these socks the other day, we're thinking about percentages of a whole that add up to 100%. 45% polyester, 44 cotton, 9 rayon, plus 1 nylon, plus 1 spandex equals 100. Okay, next slide, please. So this is the one that anybody that was on the Facebook group saw without the numbers in there a couple of days ago. You can see up top, so I have this formula. It's 1,000 grams of flour, 650 of water, 20 of salt, and 10 of yeast. And up top is a loaf of bread, and it's divided by percentages like those socks are. So the flour would be 59.5, and then yada, 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 right? But bakers, when we're talking about bakers' percents, it's a little bit different. And I know sometimes this can sound and seem complicated and hard. Forget the percent part and just think of it as parts. So if you have 100 parts of flour, in this recipe, you have 65 parts of water. And you have 2 parts of salt and 1 part of yeast. Expressed as percentages, it'd be 100%, 65%, that's your hydration, 2% salt and 1% yeast. And it's just a different way of thinking about, it's all ratios, but it's ratios in relation to flour rather than in relation to the whole. And I don't want to get too deep into the math part of it or the whys of it. It does help you scale recipes in a very easy way. It also can help you compare different recipes or different formulas. If you break them down into percentages, you can kind of at a glance see, oh, well, that only had, yeah, that didn't taste as salty as I'm used to because it only has 1.5% salt. You know, so it's less salt in there. And or I had that one had, oh, that had 2% yeast. That's why it was moving so much faster than I'm used to, or whatever. Because I had the right temperature, but it still fermented too fast. So you can compare different things. But for us, what we're talking about today is really, we want to talk about the ratio in the starter itself. So can we go on to the next slide, please? So the ratio that we were talking about earlier with the feeding is you know, do you use 100% flour and 100% starter, or do you use 50% starter and feed it that 100% flour? That's how you vary the ratios there. Now so after you've done these different manipulations and use these different variables in different ways in your starter, you still are going to have a dough to mix. And you have the variables there too. You have ratios in your dough. You have temperature that you can run your dough at. And you can ferment for longer or shorter times. And all those go together again. So you can see on the top, we have that starter that we fed 3 times every 8 hours. And we're using that to mix a dough. And then it grows, it fully ferments in a, you know, probably, I don't know, 4 hours, 5 hours or something. And then we make it up into breads and put them in our baskets and let them proof for another couple hours. And then they go into the oven. And on the bottom, we have a little less starter, and it was only fed twice. And it started out with a smaller amount of starter and a bigger amount of flour. So that was the feast that we gave that culture, and we only gave it to them twice because it took them longer. And so we add that into our dough, and it mix that dough. And let's say we keep it at the same temperature, but it takes a little longer to ferment because there's less of that culture. It needs to ferment longer. And then we make it into our breads, and then maybe we put it in the refrigerator overnight and before we put it in the oven. So we've slowed that one down. Can we go to the next slide, please? So one of the biggest variables in the dough side of things is how much starter do you use? And like I said, that really influences the rate of fermentation for the dough itself. So you can see here, you have a total amount of flour. And again, going back to our recipe that we were just talking about, we have 1,000 grams, a whole kilogram of flour. And we have 650 grams of water and 20 grams of yeast. But instead, of salt. But instead of using 10 grams of commercial yeast, we're going to use our sourdough. But we need to decide how much sourdough to use. If we want that sort of faster fermentation, we want more of that kind of French style Pano style sourdough that's a little milder. It has that nice complex flavor, but it has that milder, sweeter acid to it. It's there, it's underneath, it's supporting everything, but it's not tangy. There's some tang, some sour to it, but it's less. It's more on that lactic side. Then we're going to use more of the flour is going to be in that starter. So you can see here, we've taken 30% of the flour, or 300 of that 1,000 grams, and we're making our starter with that. And so because we have that 60% hydration in our starter, it's 180 grams of water. That's our total starter. That's like what we end up with after we feed it a couple of times or 3 times. Okay, so you have to kind of back that down to what you start with, but you're going to end up with a starter that is 480 grams. And you're going to use the other 700 grams of flour and 470 grams of water in your dough trough and mix that together to make your dough. And of course, add that 20 grams of salt. But if you want to slow it down, if you want to make a tangier sourdough, one way to get there, besides all the other things you've done, you've probably fed your starter a colder temperature only a couple of times and let it ferment for longer in between, and maybe you let it ferment for 12 hours before you're going to even mix your dough. But you're going to want to use a smaller ratio of starter in there. So you're only going to use 10% of the total flour. And that only calls for, that's 100 grams, so it's only calling for 60 grams of water, right? So when you make your final dough, it's going to be the same dough. It's just the ratio of the starter is different. So you're going to have to put 900 grams of flour in the trough and 590 grams of water, and then your 160 grams of starter. And your same is 20 grams of salt in there. You're going to mix that together. And yes, it's going to be slower. It's going to ferment longer. It's going to need longer to ferment to the same degree. So you're going to come out with, when you're changing these variables, you can't change just one or the other and expect the same, expect great results. You're going to have to pay attention to the dough itself. And so it may take a little longer. And that's why if you have a recipe from one baker but you're going to use a method from another baker and kind of mix those, what I'm trying to show you is that when you're changing these variables, other things are going to change along with it. And again, this isn't either or, there's a lot of in between as well. And I kind of find it fun to experiment with that and change. One thing I've been doing, I did last summer more, I haven't had a lot of time to do it lately, but is just trying to change just one variable and isolate that variable. But in reality, to make a good bread, you have to work with all of them together. Next slide. Oh, that's it. Okay. So I don't know if I've made it more confusing or cleared some things up for anybody, but I imagine that maybe you have some more questions, and I would love to field those now, either through Nora, or if you want to talk direct, I would love to do that.
Yeah, we have a few more questions that people had dropped in the chat while you were presenting that I'll kick your way. And then if people have more questions, put them in the chat and I can ask them. Or if you want to ask David directly, just drop your name in the chat. So one person asks, are there different ratio considerations for gluten-free flour?
Boy, I don't know, because I haven't done a whole lot of gluten-free baking. I would say maybe yes and no. I think each type of flour is going to respond differently depending on, the starch content of it, and then what enzymes you have in there converting the starch to simple sugars so that the yeast and bacteria can even convert it. But I think that you could start out with the same kind of general ratios and see what happens. And if you're not getting the results you want, think about, is it moving faster than it should, or is it moving too slowly? One thing with gluten-free is you have to be careful. If it moves too slowly, you might lose your structure because you're getting structure from something other than gluten, obviously. And those structures can be more fragile.
We are getting so many great questions. We're going to have you here all night, David. One person asked, should you pour off the liquid on the top if the starter hasn't been fed in a while?
Again, you can, but you can mix it in too. Probably you want to pour it off and then feed it fresh. A solid starter doesn't tend to have the hooch on top. If you're using a liquid starter, it does. It depends on how long it's sat. I'm assuming that it's in the refrigerator, say it's gone 2 weeks instead of 1 week, mix it in. If it's gone 4 weeks instead of 1 week, discard it. Pour it off because you're going to be pouring some of that acid off. Too much acid can start to break things down. I've seen sourdoughs and worked with sourdough doughs that had so much acid in them that there was no gluten left at all. It just shredded, and they were like pancake loaves. So if you build up too much acid, that's a problem, and that's where you can rescue that by either much larger feedings or. So this is where I said before I didn't want to confuse people, because there's two things that larger feeding can do. A larger feeding kind of as part of your method, as part of one of your variables, like I said, can slow down your fermentation rate and help you get more acetic acid, a tangier sourdough. You can also feed a bigger ratio to a small amount of starter and keep the time short and then feed it again. And that will help to buffer the acid and revive your sourdough. But if it's really built up so much acid, it's not the pH balance anymore, and it's just too much acid, period, in there, then you have to do the washing method that I told you about. And even if you have a liquid starter, you make it really stiff, and then you can dilute it again at the end after it's washed and get it back to your same hydration.
Awesome. I promise this question is coming from someone in the audience. They asked about your wonderful book, Bread on the Table. They were wondering a little bit about what you can find in the book if people pick that up.
Oh, awesome. Well, Bread on the Table is kind of a little bit of my journey, my own personal journey as a baker, and kind of looks at bread through different bread traditions, mostly European. Yes, it's very Eurocentric. I'm sorry. But that's been my experience. But it looks at different bread cultures and how they interact with their cuisine. Kind of, but it's also very much a bread baking book. It's very much about methods. There is a Levon, the sourdough recipe, how to start your own. There's also a rye sour. So there are some sourdough breads. There are also yeasted breads, but there's a chapter about French breads and then some French foods that go with them, and then Italian breads, and like one of them is the salt-free Tuscan bread, which all on its own is kind of, I don't know, if you're used to salted breads, it's kind of weird. But if you eat it with the really super flavorful and often saltier Tuscan foods, it's a foil to them, and it makes more sense. So that's one thing I explore. There's a chapter on German baking and a chapter on Scandinavian baking, and then one that's kind of more Texas. And there's we head south of the border a couple of times for birote and for tortillas. So it's a journey through those things, a little bit of my story at the same time, but it's a bread baking book, and there's lots of methods, different things like scalding rye flour. There's the sourdough things, but then it's also includes some recipes for some foods and some, kind of things that explain how, French eat bread differently than the Germans and Scandinavians. So that's what it's about.
It sounds fabulous. Everyone should pick up a copy. We have a couple of different questions about equipment. People are asking, what kind of kitchen accessory do you recommend baking your bread in? A Dutch oven maybe? And then, do you have a preferences for like American scales versus European baker scale? Or just any kind of accessory tips that you might have?
Okay. So you don't need a whole lot to start baking bread, certainly, but then I kind of hear in this question, you've been baking sourdough now for a while, and you wondering what to add to your arsenal, or what kind of things you might want to play with. And I've tried the Dutch oven method, and I like it. It's it does a lot of things that mimic a brick oven by using the moisture of the loaf itself for that oven spring and to set the crust. I find it a little bit limiting in shapes. It's harder to make a long loaf unless you have an oval Dutch oven or one of those cloak or something. My new favorite method is using a baking stone, but then using a bowl to cover the bread for the first 15 to 20 minutes. So what that does is stainless steel bowl. What that does is the same thing as the Dutch oven, but you're getting that more intense heat from the baking stone than you do from the Dutch oven. And the Dutch oven, because it's metal, it has what I call a more flashy heat. So you get a little bit more, you get a dark bottom. You get an overcooked bottom where the side crust is much lighter. I have found that, at least in a gas oven, I have found that if you put a sheet pan on the rack right below the Dutch oven, that helps some. But really, I prefer the baking stone, and then just using rather than trying to create steam, which just doesn't stay in a home oven very well. It's not that you can't create the steam, it's just hard to keep it in there, especially if you have a gas oven, because it's naturally designed to vent all the gases in there so that it doesn't build up and explode or kill us with carbon monoxide or whatever. It's supposed to vent the stuff that burns, the fumes and stuff. So it also vents the steam, unfortunately. So capturing that steam with a metal bowl inverted over, and then I use the gloves from the barbecue, the big heavy leather gloves, to lift it off carefully after 20 minutes, and then finish the bake just with it on the stone, and I get really, really great results from that. As far as scales, for a home baker, digital scales these days are not expensive. Definitely you want to get one that's accurate to a gram or whatever that's equivalent. I love working in metric. All my recipes are in metric because it's the same as baker's percents. It's based off of tens and hundreds, and it's really easy to see those percentages right away with metric. And as long as you're using the same the same system all the way through, it's just numbers. You don't have to think about how many ounces 10 grams is, because you're just going to use grams all the way through, including with your water. But then another neat thing with metric is that a gram is a milliliter, so you can even use a pitcher to measure your water in milliliters. So a nice digital scale is probably the most handy. I kind of, when we're in production, I do like a balance scale because I find once you use a balance scale, you can go faster because you can read the scale and how fast it's dropping and whether you need to take some off or not. It's just if you, I find myself and other bakers sort of trying to just get it to that exact gram weight with a digital scale, because you've got that number, you got to have it exact, and that just, you're fussing with it too much. Whereas a balance scale, you're getting it in that range, but you can just kind of move and flow with it. But for a home baker where you're doing 1 or 2 loaves at a time, the balance doesn't make a big difference. So but there's another thing, especially if you're a home baker, there is a certain romance to this. I think there's a romance to it. And the romance of it is part of what keeps me doing it. So I love to use, when I do bake at home, I love to use a wooden trough. You don't have to go out and get a wooden trough. You can use a metal bowl or a ceramic bowl, whatever you have. But if you're into it and you feel like it, go get a wooden trough. I found mine in Castroville at an antique store. It was from Hungary, and it's beautiful and it's fun to use. But is it necessary to make a great sourdough? Absolutely not. I've also been using the Ankersrum kitchen assistant. It's a different kind of mixer. Haven't used it enough to really feel that I know it 100%, but I've been producing some nice doughs with it. So if again, if I'm going to make bread at home, most of the time I'm going to knead it by hand because that's part of what I'm doing. That's part of why I'm doing it. But every once in a while, especially like if we want some pizza dough for tonight in the morning or something, I might just throw it all in the mixer and mix it up. And you can use a KitchenAid. There's a couple of tricks to do than that, but this Ankersrum, I'm finding mixes a really nice dough. I'm not associated with them, or it's not a paid advertisement. It's just what I've been using lately. The other important things are, of course, a bowl scraper and a bench knife scraper. Beyond that, you don't need a whole lot.
Fabulous.
More questions?
Great tips. Yes, we have more. Everyone has so many great questions. All right, we have a question about starting to kind of incorporate some additional elements if they want to make sort of a fancier loaf. When making the dough, if they want to incorporate sugar, chocolate, or nuts, what's a good time? When should they be adding that to their dough?
Sugar is interesting. Sugar goes in the beginning. But you have to be careful with sugar, with sourdoughs. You don't want to, it's just, there are some different methods for doing, and I haven't done a whole lot of sweet doughs with sourdough, but you definitely can do them. But sugar goes in the beginning. The nuts, chocolate, anything chunky like that, even other grains, even if they're soaked or cooked, like you can take whole rye kernels and boil them and soften them, but they'll go in the end, because if you're hand mixing and you're doing folds, you might want to wait till the 3rd or 4th fold and fold them in, depending on the mixing method you're using. Basically, you want to develop your gluten first and then add those things in, because they can tend to tear the gluten as it's developing and make it harder to develop the gluten. So chunky things go in at the end. Fats can go in at the end unless they're just a small amount. So if you're trying to add a lot of olive oil or a lot of butter to a dough, you want to do that after your gluten is developed as well, because those fats, they're called shortening because they shorten the gluten. They prevent it from really making that nice web structure. They slow that down. They prohibit it. So when you're making flaky and short pastries, you want to surround your flour with lots of fat to prevent too much gluten from forming. In bread, you want to form that gluten first and then add in the fat. There are exceptions to that, as there's always exceptions to rules, but and certainly with a small percentage of fat, you can put it in the beginning, but often you want to add the fat after the gluten's developed.
We're also getting a number of great questions around flour. So I'm going to kind of maybe group them together, and then you can answer them as you like. And if I ask you, if I pepper you with too many, just tell me that you've forgotten some of them, and I'll go back. So people are asking, what kind of flour do you recommend using? Is there a difference between flour used in the United States versus flour used in France? If there is, or Europe in general, kind of what's the difference? And then also getting into like a rye or a whole wheat bread, do you recommend putting a rye or a wheat in some of your starter, or are you just going to incorporate it into the bread?
Okay, excellent questions. Let's take them one at a time. I like using a hard red winter wheat, but not necessarily a bread flour. Depends on what I'm making. If I really want to make a nice pan bread, I might use the bread flour, what's labeled as bread flour on the grocery store shelf. But most of the time I'm going to use what's called an all-purpose, but not just any all-purpose, because a lot of all-purpose flours are sort of a mix of hard and soft wheats to get the kind of, to make them more all-purpose. But a few brands use hard red winter wheat. The most famous probably is King Arthur. They've always used hard red winter wheat. And in fact, when a famous French baker came to the States back in the early 90s, that was the King Arthur all-purpose flour is what he picked out as the closest to what he was used to using in France. It has less protein than what was called a bread flour. Not a lot less, but less. And that's kind of, when you're trying to make like a pan bread with a nice even crumb, you want it more elastic and you want that higher protein. When you're trying to make artisan breads where you have a little more open structure, that irregular structure to it, you want a little bit more extensibility, and the lower protein flours tend to have that. French flours themselves are considerably different. They don't absorb as much water, but the balance of extensibility and elasticity is different. And it's really hard to find that true equivalent in America. But we have some excellent flours, and certainly they export a lot of wheat even to France to make flour. But with small adjustments, like I said, just adding that 10% to my starter in New York just made all the difference in the world. I was fortunate enough to have been able to go visit that bakery and see the difference. And that's what the light bulb went off, and I came home and added a little bit more water and got this better results from it. So it's just, you do have to, baking does take some experience. It takes a lot of patience. Not just patience, with the whole process, which takes time, obviously, but you also have to have some patience with yourself, because there still is. I mean, it's all down to science, but a lot of the science isn't all that known. So a lot of baking is still by feel and by experience. That's one thing that I've learned. In terms of, but I wouldn't worry too much about trying to go find French flour or worrying about that. You can still make excellent breads. You want it to be unbleached, and you want it to be that's kind of lower protein. We at Easy Tiger use central milling flour. As I've said a lot of times, one of the big differences with central milling is that instead of just buying commodity wheat, They contract with farmers to grow specific varieties just for them because they feel like they have the better quality for artisan baking. That's why they call them artisan flours. It's not just a marketing thing. And also they have superior flavor. A lot of times because just the breeding priorities have been for higher protein and higher yields and disease resistance for commodity wheat. And they've just left out the attention to flavor. So a lot of commodity wheat isn't that flavorful. But the varieties that Central Milling contracts to grow have better flavor. And that's how I chose that flour. This is an open secret. I've asked and been told that it's okay to say this. And I'm not repping anybody here, but the Whole Foods organic 365 all-purpose flour is milled by Central Milling and has a lot of the same characteristics as the flour that we use at Easy Tiger. King Arthur is also another excellent flour for baking at home. And of course, I do have to plug Barton Springs Mill, our local mill that has a wonderful variety of whole grains, and then does sift out some of the flours down to about as white as you can get off a stone ground into his 00 flours, and has made a couple of all-purpose blends. But he makes some amazing flours. As far as adding in whole grains, you can do lots of different approaches there too, and it's fun to experiment. I was really curious at one point when I worked in this big bakery that we had grown a lot. And we maintained a separate whole wheat starter and a white starter. And I was like, can't we just replace it all with white? Because we have these big machines to mix the white starter and we don't have one for the whole wheat. We're still doing that in a garbage pail, not obviously dedicated to the starter, but just that's the size that we use. And so I tried it. I did those ratios and I said, okay, I'm going to use white starter. So whatever amount of flour is in that starter, I have to take that away from the white and add in whole wheat into the dough side. So the total amounts were the same percentages. Just where did I get that whole wheat from? Is it coming from the starter or is it going into the dough? And lo and behold, the bread tasted different, quite a bit different. So there are things going on when you're feeding your starter with whole grain flour that does change it. There's more stuff available. There's more enzymes breaking down more starch to sugars. There's also more sugars present. And the other things that are in there, they actually increase the fermentation, which is a great thing, but it can, again, to control that, you have to control a couple of those other variables. It's just one more variable that you're adding in there. But if you're aware of that, if you understand that the whole grains are going to ferment faster and more, then you can control it somewhere else in your in the whole process. And I won't say that the bread that I tried with the white starter and the whole wheat recipe was still a good bread. It just wasn't the same. So it's one of those fun things. You have 4 basic ingredients and you can change them up so many different ways to make hundreds and hundreds of different kinds of breads. All right, I think I covered all of those.
You did. You knocked it out of the park. You remembered every single question. It was great. If anybody else has any more questions, drop them into the chat. I think we're going to get pretty close to wrapping up. David, we're getting some just great comments of people saying thank you. What a wonderful presentation. They're buying the book. They've learned so much. So if you have a question.
Thank you very much.
Yeah. Thank you to everyone for tuning in. If you have any more questions, add them in now. Otherwise, I think we are going to just give David a big round of applause for this wonderful presentation. We're getting lots of thanks rolling in. And everyone, like we said, this video we posted on the Texas Farmers Market YouTube page. So if you want to go back and reference David's wonderful slide presentation, you can do that there. So thank you, everyone. And especially thank you to David. Everyone have a
Well, thank you.
Evening.
Thank you, Nora, and to the Farmers Market. We're so proud to be a part of it on a weekly basis. And I'm also really enjoy coming back to the Fermentation Festival because we call ourselves bakers and that's what we do at the end of the process, but we're really fermenters. So that's what everything's established in that fermentation process with bread. So thank you very much. Please, if you aren't already, join our Breadwinners group on Facebook. It's been a really fun experience there, where not only is it fun to interact myself and I'm getting more involved with it again, but also the whole group has just taken on a life of its own and people are interacting with each other in this really great organic way. So thank you very much. I've really enjoyed being here, and yeah, interact with me. I'm Dough Puncher on Instagram and I'm on Facebook, and I would love to answer any more questions if you want to send them my way. Thank you very much.
Wonderful. Thanks, David. Everyone, have a great night. Take care.